Hey everyone, welcome back to Reckoning with Jason Herbert. I am your host and creator, Jason Herbert, and today is the start of Autism Awareness Month, both here in the United States and in the UK. So, I brought on for you a very special guest. I'm talking about Dr. Gina Rippon. She's Emeritus Professor of Cognitive Neuroimaging at the Aston Brain Center in the UK. And more to the point, she is the author of the brand new book being released today entitled Off the Spectrum, Why the Science of Autism Has Failed Women and Girls. So today, we're going to have a conversation about autism, what it is, the misconceptions behind it, and also why women and girls have often been left behind when we're talking about research and study of autism. This is a really great, fascinating conversation on something that I think is really important to a lot of us, myself included. So sit back and relax. Reckoning with Jason Herbert kicks off now. All right, Gina, I'm so excited to talk to you about this book today. I was just telling you before we started recording, I have this one right here. They sent to me, and I love this. They sent me the advanced reader copy of this, of your new book. And I love getting these things because I feel like I'm the only one who gets to see them. Or not many people get to see the early versions of the books, which I have this own little collection of mine now that I have. I love this book. I am so excited to talk to you about it.
Version of the English one, which
yes, do you have it?
I do. I just got it yesterday.
Okay. Oh, really? Oh! You even has. I like that title, "The Lost Girls of Autism." I like this. I like this, and I like the cover. Do you have a preference as far as which one you prefer?
I think the only thing is with I like the Lost Girls, and that was what it originally was. It was the American publishers who changed it. And in a way, that captures exactly, hopefully you'll agree, what the book is about. But there is a bit of an issue nowadays with talking just about girls, because particularly in the autism community, as we'll probably get to, there's quite high incidence of gender variance. And so using the term girls feels not as inclusive as it could, even though it actually really sums up the story.
Yeah, so I've been telling some friends of mine about this book the last couple of days as I started to dig into this book. And I kind of always do that as I'm reading stuff that I really like. And I was trying to, it's funny that you mentioned that because I was like, okay, this book is about girls and women. Is it like, what are the words I should be using here? Because girls didn't seem to quite capture it. And I'm always, I don't know, maybe I'm in my own head, Gina, where I'm thinking about like my own position as like a straight white guy thinking about my positionality, and I never want to sound condescending or anything like that. And dare I say it here in the United States, a dirty word, I actually want to be inclusive. So, yeah.
Tricky nowadays over there.
Oh my gosh. There's more information I just saw that we're shopping this morning we can talk about. But before we do that, do you want to introduce yourself and introduce your work for our audience?
Yes, certainly. So my name's Gina Rippon, and I'm a Professor Emeritus of Cognitive Neuroimaging from Aston University in Birmingham. So effectively, my research career has been based around brain imaging techniques of various kinds. So I've metaphorically rooted around in people's brains throughout my research career to discover what's going on in the brains, in particular aspects of behavior. So the two going together is very important. And because I'm very interested in how brains get to be different, a lot of early research was trying to find the common factors in everybody's brains. I want to know why brains are different, how they get to be different, and what those differences mean for their owners. So a lot of my work has been to do with atypical behavior, such as schizophrenia, also developmental disorders, like dyslexia, and most recently, autism. And I've also, as one would if you're talking about brain differences, got drawn into the whole female brain, male brain controversy, which is what my last book was about. Because if you're going to talk about brain differences, you can't not talk about sex differences in the brain, as I discovered.
I have all kinds of questions for you today. I have two boys, and at some point in time, I have to ask you about how their brains develop as teenagers because I have no idea. I am flush in the middle of having a 17-year-old and a 13-year-old here in a couple of weeks, and I'm lost, Gina. I'm completely lost. I have no idea. And they're boys, and they're just like me, and I'm terrified. Um, but we're here to talk about this book that you wrote. Here in the States, it's called Off the Spectrum, Why the Science of Autism Has Failed Women and Girls. I'm very excited to talk to you about this. I guess maybe the first question I have for you is why write a book about autism and women and girls, and why this book was needed as you kind of started to think about this. It's like, wait a second, this needs to be a separate conversation.
Right. Well, actually, I think I mentioned it in the preface. It seems a long time ago now that I wrote it. For several years, various colleagues and myself, calling ourselves feminist neuroscientists, have been very critical about the state of research into sex differences in the brain, into typical brains. In particular, the kind of what we call the myth of the female brain and the male brain, and have written variously criticizing the research. Not saying that there aren't differences, because anatomically there almost invariably are, but the amount of significance that's been attached to being a female, you must therefore have a female brain, and this is what it's like, and ditto with males, idea that they're completely different. And perhaps more importantly, that means that you have different skills, different skill sets, different abilities, different temperaments, and that will suit you or not suit you for different roles in the world. So we established this idea that we wanted to, myth bust in that area. And we were then taken to task for the fact that there are several brain-based conditions where epidemiologically, in terms of the prevalence of the disorder, more females than males get Alzheimer's, for example, succumb to Alzheimer's, more males than females succumb to Parkinson's disease. So there was an impression that we were trying to stop people doing this kind of research. We were saying should be banned, it's politically incorrect, etc. Which was never the case, but that was, too good a straw man to resist. So then I got told off and said, look, you're an autism researcher, because that was, I was very much involved in brain imaging, autistic brain imaging, very sort of technical end of that research. And one of the areas where it's really important that we do this kind of sex differences research is autism, because autism is a male problem, and therefore we need to know why boys get autism and girls don't, effectively. So I thought I ought to really look into this, fair enough, seemed fair enough. And as an autism researcher, I fell into exactly that same kind of mindset. Very few of the people I was scanning were female, and I just thought, well, that's because not many girls get autism, etc., etc. But then I thought, well, I'll have a close look at the literature around sex differences in the autistic brain to see if, just to show I'm biased, to see if they're making the same kind of mistakes that people looking at typical sex differences. And that's when I discovered, actually, despite being taken to task for this, banning this kind of research wasn't going on. There's a decade of what I call men-only autism brain imaging research, when in various statistics, 70% of the studies only looked at boys, only looked at men. And we're developing, quite highly technical, plausible models of the autistic brain to try and explain why these individuals experience the world differently. But it was all based on male brains. So the model was based solely on males, autistic males. And that's when I thought, well, I'm being told off for doing something, for preventing something which isn't happening anyway. So I went into that in some detail. And then I thought, well, how has this come about? Why? Has it always been the idea that this is a male problem? And how did it develop? And how is this, it's the subject of a hugely valuable diagnostic industry And have they missed out as well? Presumably they've got these watertight tests which prove, there's so many more males than females. And then I started to unpack that and discovered that also was flawed. And then the whole idea of what autism is, what it looks like, what people believe it to be, clearly showed the same kind of bias. If teachers are presented with a case study of a child who's showing behavioural problems and asked, do you think this child has autism and should they get some help? Much more likely to think the child does have autism and needs help if the child is, this hypothetical child is called Jack, than if the child is called Chloe. So at every point of the autism pipeline, there is this bias, which we've all accepted and which actually is deeply flawed. And at the end of it, there's a large group of autistic women who have spent decades of their lives being misdiagnosed, overlooked, given wrong kind of medication, suffering severe mental health problems, who eventually somebody says, I think you might be autistic, and everything falls into place. So that's a long answer to the question about how I got to write this book.
Well, I'm fascinated by this, and I should probably go ahead and reveal to you that both of my boys, who I mentioned earlier, are on the spectrum, including one named Jack. And I'll tell you, it's interesting that you say this, because I remember when Jack was first diagnosed, it wasn't by a medical practitioner or anyone like that. It was actually by his caregiver at a preschool. He was 4 years old, and she said, "I really think you need to go have him looked at for autism. I think that he's showing traits." It was, and I remember at the time I was completely in denial when this happened. Of course, I think this is very common. He was 4, yeah. Yeah. But it was actually his preschool teacher who said, "Hey, I think this is something you need to," and I was absolutely not, right? No, not my child. And we can talk about that a little bit later on as far as what the parents go through. But I remember at the time going, "Oh my gosh, what does this mean?" And I guess maybe that's kind of a segue, Gina, into asking, what does it mean? I think that right now in the United States, at least, and I pray to God or something, or I don't know, that you're not having to go through the same brain damage in the UK as we are here in the States about autism and vaccines and the willful ignorance surrounding this. But for those of us who are listening, who are curious, who are maybe have relationships with people who have autism or are autistic, I guess is probably the better way to say it. Can we talk just briefly about when we say autism, what are we talking about? I think that there's so much floating around there that people people immediately go to Rain Man in their head or things like that because of what pop culture has told us.
Yes.
Can you talk to us about what autism is and maybe the differences between, say, being autistic or having autism? This always drives me nuts, and kind of go from there.
Yeah. Well, I'll take the second bit first. There is quite an issue within the autism community about autistic identity, and they actually prefer, on the whole, to be referred to as an autistic person rather than a person with autism, because they feel that their autistic characteristics are part of who they are. They're not somebody with diabetes or something like that. Yes. So I think that partly, and the issue of identity is very important, as I discovered, as a neuroscientist who happened to peep out from under my scanner and suddenly realized, a whole world of lived experience out there, which I should have been engaging with. So I think that's one issue. What is autism is I don't know, it is a multi-billion dollar question, given the amount of money that's
spent. We have all weekend.
Sorry?
So we have all weekend to discuss it. Go on.
Yeah, okay. Just as well. So it's I refer to it as shape-shifting. And I think at some point in the book I talk about a Humpty Dumpty quote, when Humpty Dumpty says a word is what I want it to mean. And if you look at autism, it's a bit like that, because it's changed. I mean, it's been with us as the emerging as a condition. I'll put it that in quotes, and we'll get back to that probably. Over 80, maybe 100 years, which is another part of the story. And at the beginning, it was rare. It was characterized, it was developmental disorder, so it was only seen in children, and it was children who'd had the problem emerging gradually, in some cases, but quite dramatically in others, very early on, and characterized by very abnormal types of behavior, which was characterized by what Kanner, the so-called father, one of the so-called fathers of autism, called aloofness or sort of elective isolation. He described these children as not having any evidence of forming effective connections, particularly with parents, for example, but not showing any signs of needing them. So very isolated, lonely, alone little boys and girls, need to add that at the beginning, who just didn't seem to have the kind of social connection that their peers did. And that and autism means self-withdrawn, etc. So the term focuses on that as a problem. The behavioural aspects were much more to do with sort of strange rituals or very focused, intense interests, strange motor atypicalities like hand flapping, etc. So quite a clearly defined, quite narrow type of behavioural problem. And then over the years, it's become more and more inclusive. I mean, in the States last year, the CDC was talking about 1 in 36 8-year-olds having been diagnosed with autism. So you begin to think, other issues about what constitutes normal. If you've got a condition which is supposedly not normal, which is found in 1 in 36 individuals, then then that seems something we need to look at. And it became much more less extreme atypical behaviour. And I would say at this point, most of the book, as you will have noticed, is to do with this unfortunate term, the different one end of the spectrum. It used to be called high functioning autism, and that was felt to be disrespectful in some way. So there are individuals who are diagnosed as being on the spectrum who are severely impaired, non-verbal, will be institutionalized all their lives, self-injurious, etc., non-compliant. So that aspect of autism has remained, but it's become much more inclusive. So there are variations of the difficulties you find at the other end. So they have language, but it's slightly strange use of language. And once you can start assessing their cognitive and social skills, you realise that there's a kind of range of difficulties which can be found on individuals who've been diagnosed as being on the spectrum. So again, that's a very long answer. In fact, the first chapter of the book, I think, is called What is Autism? And when the editor got it, they said, so you spent 7,000 words saying that actually we don't know. So there's been a different picture, and there is no clear biomarker. For example, you can't put somebody in a scanner or do a genetic test or something and say this person is autistic or this person has autism. Or so it's all assessed behaviourally in a really trying to think of the phrase. The kind of diagnostic process is hugely complex, very tortuous, actually, very lengthy, which is why the waiting lists are so long. But it's all self-report or subjective interpretation of this is unusual, this is something we should be looking at, etc. So again, a very long answer to say we don't really know what it is. There's lots of words attached to it.
Well, I feel like, first of all, that's really one of the important things that first chapter really does in the book, because again, I think that in my conversations with people and things like that, there seems to be a general understanding of what autism is, but I find that general understanding is really more of a sign of a general misunderstanding of what autism is. And I also find that like books like yours, and we've got a bunch of them here on our between the boy's mother and myself, really denote just how much research how much we still need to learn about this. My boy's mother, her aunt is an autism researcher. She likes to say that autism is a spectrum and we're all on it. And I've always kind of taken some solace maybe in that. I don't know if taking solace is the right word, because this isn't a thing. Autism is not a thing that you should be ashamed of, or this is just a component of the human experience. But it is still something that even I, as the father of two autistic children, Gina, I kind of go, how do I conceptualize this, and how do I talk about this with other people? And that's such, I think, a sign of the importance of the work. I want to ask you this. We talk about how we're still understanding what autism is. And now here in the States, I kind of referenced this earlier, we've got RFK Jr. saying that you've got autism through vaccines and all sorts of things. So you get it from licking toads under a rock. I don't know, right? Can we talk a little bit about what we know about how people get autism? Like, again, getting autism feels weird too, because it's like that's kind of gets back to the idea of having autism. But how do we know how autism shows up? I guess is the word I'm saying. Is it inherited? What do we know?
Well, I think as a brain researcher, I would say that, first of all, we need to remember that autism, in all its manifestations, accepting that it's a bit of a fuzzy concept, is highly heritable. So it's clearly something which has some kind of physical component. And that it started to emerge in the 1980s, which really changed the thinking about autism, because up till then, there'd been a kind of psychoanalytical approach, the refrigerator mother story, for example, that autism was caused by a lack of paternal-maternal bonding, etc., etc. So, but it really, for me, autism is something which is produced by a miswired brain. So if you start to look at all the genetic research that's been done so far, the kind of brain imaging work that colleagues, the team I've been working with, and worldwide, autistic brains, or the brains of autistic people, are different, and they're differently wired from the beginning. And I use the term wired slightly anxiously, because lots of people think about hardwiring and all of that, which is a misunderstanding. But it means that brains develop differently. And the owners of those brains experience the world differently. They have different difficulties, such as high levels of sensory sensitivities, which can interfere hugely with everyday life. And I think that's the other thing when you said, people say we're all on the spectrum. It's a slightly dismissive term in that it suggests that, you just got a bit more of what everybody else has, forgetting that, for example, the sensory sensitivities and the difficulties with emotional regulation, difficulties with social interaction, interfere with people's lives, in some cases quite profoundly, but in some cases on a daily basis, but enough to cause them difficulties, and difficulties for those who care for them, and difficulties for people in their environment. So I think what I'm saying is that there is this brain which is developed differently, and as a consequence, it interacts with the world differently. And because we now know that brains are very plastic and respond to experiences and attitudes in the outside world, that differently developing brain will continue to develop differently. And the kind of behaviors that it underpins are the kind of behaviors that will earn you a diagnosis of autism.
Speaking of diagnosing autism, this is a thing that it seems to be, as I talk to other people, or you see the dialogue here in the States, people weren't talking about autism in the 1970s, or they only started talking about autism in the 80s or 90s. I think in the book you talk about how the very first person who was diagnosed passed only recently in 2023.
Yes, last year.
Yes. Yeah. Can we talk a little bit, because as I look at this, Gina, I keep thinking this can't be a 20th century phenomenon. This is a thing we've become aware of in the preceding decades. But I have to imagine autism has been around as long as people have. At least that's how I've kind of internalized it myself. Can you talk a little bit about how we've become aware of autism, like how the research has evolved? What happened to Asperger's syndrome?
Yeah.
How's the
Yes.
science behind this?
Yeah. Well, I think the kind of behaviours that nowadays would get called autistic have always been with us. I think that would be a way of saying that. And Simon Baron-Cohen's recently written a book called The Pattern Seekers, which talks about creativity, the history of creativity and invention and discovery, and links it very firmly to a particular way of thinking, which is characteristic of some, but not all, autistic individuals. And so, we're going way back to prehistory and discovering musical instruments and tools and things like that. So that kind of behaviour has been with us. The issue of psychiatric diagnosis, and I have to put in a rider at that stage that autism isn't necessarily a psychiatric disorder, but even though you find it in manuals of psychiatric disorders. So once a label was discovered, as it were, and this goes back to the whole history of psychiatry, that physical medicine seemed to be doing well by finding common characteristics in fevers, for example, discovering that different things caused different fevers. And so once you discovered that, then you could focus on those individuals and say, did the medicine work well for them, or what was the outcome, etc. So there was this idea that if you could put a name, find a category, put a name to it, that had strong implications for treatment, research, for the individuals themselves. Telling somebody that you have got depression, type 1 depression or something, meant for some people, at last I've got a name for this problem. That means that they're going to be able to deal with it. And I think the same kind of thing happened with autism, because early on, psychiatry wasn't really looking at children. So there were children who clearly from birth were disabled in some kind of way, and were generally, called mentally retarded, or whatever the phrase used at the time was. And it was then researchers like Hannah who said, we've got these disturbed children, but they're not all the same. Maybe some have behaved differently, and we could look at those and see what that meant. And so that's where terms like autism came from. And he talked about it as childhood schizophrenia, and then it was infantile autism. So, back to the Humpty Dumpty thing, the name is changed, but they're actually describing the same condition. I think I might have lost sight of the question now, but anyway.
Oh, no, it's wonderful. I do want to, because the work focuses on girls and women, I want to ask you though, so many times, and I know that you're keenly aware of this, research by men also has historically been highlighted over those by women. I'm actually over my right shoulder is a book about women Egyptologists written by my friend Kate Shepard. And I'm really keen on understanding who maybe the mothers of autism research are, like because you talk about this as well.
Yeah, you mean mothers in terms of the way in which Kanner and Asperger are referred to as the fathers? Yeah. Okay. Well, initially, I think I just talk about Grynia Sukareva as the mother of autism, because she was writing, I think it's her 100th anniversary in 1926, 24 to 26. She was a very eminent female Russian psychiatrist who wrote 2 sets of case studies about children that she was studying in her hospitals that she set up, across Russia as it was at the time, describing exactly the same patterns of behaviour that Kanner 20 years later described. And in fact, as has been pointed out, if you picked up the current diagnostic and statistical manual DSM-5, you would find the description of autism very similar to hers. So she had a tremendous insight into different kind of aspects of behaviour. But importantly for my story, she wrote about a set of boys and a set of girls, and she very carefully distinguished between them, talking about the possibility that the girls express their autism in a different way. So she was, to me, the true mother of autism. It's kind of ironic that I would probably think about maybe 90% of any papers, autism websites or autism advice books or textbooks, they all say in 1943, Leo Kanner wrote blah, 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 and he is known as the father of autism. And as we know, Asperger was writing at the same time, but came to the fore later. So it's kind of, for me, ironic that the person who really discovered autism was a female and was completely overlooked in history until the last few years. There was a discovery early on, end of the last century, 1990, I think Sula Wolf was writing. Somebody said, I found these amazing work by a female psychiatrist, but they only translated the story about the boys. So, even in rescuing the mother of autism, the male bias held for that moment. With respect to another mother, I saw that question that you asked, I thought we could talk about Lorna Wing, because she was really a UK psychiatrist who, working with her colleague Judith Gould, she was the one who, as she, in her own words, had opened Pandora's box with respect to widening the definition of autism, because she said, there were accumulating cases which fitted reasonably well with the Kanner description, and she talked about Kanner's walled garden. And she and Judith Gould did a big survey of children with behavioural problems and said, there's lots of these children who don't fit into the definition of autism as it's currently used, but they do have the same kind of behavioural problems, and maybe we should widen the definition, which is what they did in DSM-3 in the 1980s. She was also an advocate of Asperger's work, and she pushed hard for the inclusion of Asperger's syndrome as a separate category of autistic, of developmental behaviour, but characterised by different problems. And that started off rumours of, an epidemic of autism, because all of a sudden there's huge increases in the number of reported cases, etc. But she really opened people's eyes. And in fact, it was her who said, almost in passing in the 1980s, she noted that there were fewer girls than boys being diagnosed, and said something along the lines of, maybe it's because they're better at disguising their autism. And that was almost a passing comment. And people say, oh, yeah, and then put it to one side. But hopefully in the last 10 years, people have said, actually, that's probably quite a prescient comment, and what a lot of my book is about.
I want to ask you, I say this, there's another book over my left shoulder by Kit Hayam, who wrote a terrific book called Before We Were Trans. And I want to ask you, we've been thus far talking about different sexual differences between boys and girls, but I'm also wondering about how autism presents across gender identity lines and things like that, because I feel like that's part of the dialogue that we've got to have as well. So I guess maybe, Gina, how does autism intersect with gender identity? Does it present differently? Like, what's your experience with that thus far?
Absolutely. In fact, yes. I mean, that's very much, as you can imagine, a hot topic at the moment. The incidence of gender variance, and I'll come back to that briefly, in the autistic population is much higher than in the neurotypical population. And the incidence of autism in the gender variant population is a lot higher. So there, epidemiologically, there does seem to be an intersection. Additional to that, and I think it's important that there's a distinction, gender dysphoria, which is very rare, but is a recognised condition of individuals who are psychologically distressed by what they perceive as a disconnect between the physical presentation of their biological sex and what they feel their identity to be. And I think it's important because sometimes debates about gender can overlook that distinction. And I think that's important. But clearly, within those 2-3 populations, there is definitely, an increased incidence. And interestingly, just now, I was just finishing off a blog post for a blog talking about autism and gender identity, because issues of identity, it turns out, are really important in autism. We've touched on this already, and the idea that you talk about yourself as an autistic person. And one of the constant themes that comes up in the really powerful personal testimonies of late diagnosed autistic women, for example, or if you talk to individuals, particularly in terms of your early comments, adolescents, autistic adolescents, are issues of identity. And the late diagnosed women, one of the first things they almost always say, it was such a relief because now I've got, I know who I am. I found my tribe. So autism is a genuine identity for these people. And one of the things they also say that these are women in their 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s even. And they say that all their life, they feel they've struggled with knowing who they are. Particularly women who, which is something I'm sure we'll get onto, who have camouflaged and masked all their lives. From a very young age, have been aware that they're different, have suffered from being called different or weird, and have struggled all their lives with trying to hide, camouflage their differences, to mask their differences. And they said that I've no idea who I really am, because in order to survive in the world, I've had to pretend to be somebody else, or I've had to hide who I really am. And when you say that, and then you compare that with interviews with gender variant individuals, very often the same sort of comments come up. They will say, particularly trans individuals will say, I needed to find my identity. I needed to own what I felt was my identity. So the narrative around those identity issues is very similar. And there is some neuroscience work which I've been writing about, which I think I put in the book, where they're actually looking at autistic transgender individuals, looking at unusual patterns of brain activity, particularly in the social brain, and reporting, and we have to be careful how causally we interpret this, higher levels of activity in those parts of the brain which are associated with self-monitoring and self-referencing, etc. These are adults, and I would always say that if, as I do, you believe the brain reflects the life you've lived, then it's unsurprising that individuals who are both autistic and transgender show unusual patterns of activity in those parts of the brain which are to do with self-identity and self-referencing.
Yeah, I think that really what we're kind of coming to now, and I really want to dive into the experience of women and girls here in just a second. I also feel like we talk about this idea of camouflaging, which I want to talk about more in a moment. I wonder, Gina, if autism is expressed differently across cultures. You and I both come from a very Western background. You've kind of foreground your own work there. Yourself in the UK, myself in the US. I'm wondering, as you worked through the literature and through your own experiences as a researcher, are we seeing deviant? Are we seeing different experiences for the autistic community, say in Eastern cultures or other spaces and things like that?
Yeah. I wish I knew the answer. I keep saying if I was reborn, I'd come back as an anthropologist. I'd love to go to different cultures. I think what's interesting is something I do comment on, that if you look at the names for autism across the world, they all reflect this core understanding that these individuals have difficulty with being social. So there is that as a common factor. But I think also as the neurodivergent movement would say, and also autistic individuals would say, a lot of the difficulties they have with their particular characteristics associated with being autistic is to do with it being accepted in the community, or if there's a stigma associated with it. And therefore, there will be cultural differences there. And sometimes, for example, when there is, again, come back to this identity issue, there's a strong gendered socialization component in the culture, for example, and there's strong expectations of what boys should be like and what girls should be like. And in those cultures, the experiences of being an autistic woman, it can be quite different. But I have to say that's a kind of impressionistic view, and I haven't looked at, the statistics vary, but not wildly. So there's no country where, I have to say that there have been countries where there's no incidence of autism because there wasn't any understanding, the use of that term. The diagnostic procedure didn't have that term, and similarly, there was no consequence for being identified as autistic. You didn't get the kind of support and the monetary support that you can get in some cultures. So, when it suddenly appears in a country, it's not because they've suddenly found autism. It's a bit like the history of autism itself, as we were talking about. They've found a name to give to a condition which in some cultures is quite shameful. So in some cultures, the numbers are low because parents don't want their families knowing that they have a child who's been called autistic, for example.
Yeah, I to a degree, I get that. Yeah, I remember, like I said, when Jack was first diagnosed, and the first question I have as a father with no experience with autism is, am I ever going to have is my child ever going to have the childhood I'd wanted him to? Am I going to be the father that I wanted to be? Everything is different now, and of course that couldn't be farther from the truth. Well,
yes. Although the answer is yes, in a way. Your child will have a different life experience, and you will have a different life experience. So that reflects reality, and it's not necessarily devastating. And certainly, again, you've possibly got a biased population of parents who write terribly movingly about how they're, how enriched their life has been by the experience of having an autistic child or autistic children. But it will be different.
Yeah, but every kid's experiences are different, and I think that maybe the thing that I had attached to autism was a negative connotation early on, and that turned out to be Jack and Ben are both just these amazing little human beings that look and act like I do. Only just there's the joy of my life, but they are boys, and this kind of brings back to the question of the book, Gina, which is how does I want to bring this back to girls and women. How does autism, does it manifest differently? You talked earlier on about the differences in brain and the plasticity of brains. Does autism present differently or manifest differently in girls and women than it does in boys and men? Like, what do we see?
Yeah, slightly anxious. I will get on to the nuance. Short answer, yes, it does. And I think that's been the problem all along, because if there was a very clear picture of what autism was like based on boys, then very few girls actually looked like that. And because of the rigidity of the diagnostic process, it is hugely rigid, there's a whole set list of questions and you get so many points. And then there's an algorithm which takes you over a clinical. And of course, if a girl passed that threshold, then actually by definition she looked like a boy, because that would be the only way in which she would actually, because she presented in the same way that the boys on which this was modelled. So of course this is part of the problem, where people were saying early on, well, there's yes, there are girls, it's interesting because people started saying to me, hey, you're a sex difference denier, which is one of the politer things I've been called. So how come you're writing about sex differences in autism? And are you saying that girls are different from boys in autism, etc.? And we'll get to that in the end. I do have a rider right at the end of the book. But yes, I think it does. And I think people are talking about a female autism phenotype, saying the reason girls have been missed is because this is what the picture is. And of course, they don't fit that picture because it presents differently. The key thing for me is the whole business about camouflaging, the whole business about, we have a definition of autism as people who are intentionally separate, alone, don't seem to need affective contact, as Cannon called it. And yet, once you start talking to these autistic girls and women, you talk to girls about their experience of being at school, they are desperate to be social. They're desperate for affective contact. They really, really want to have friends, to be part of groups, etc. And so it seems to fly in the face of what we know about autism. It's almost anti-autism, if you like. But I think when you dig a bit deeper, the problem seems to be that they still have the core difficulty with what you might call social instinct, that we all have. And I talk about somebody called Alice at the beginning of the book, somebody who is herself autistic, has had a severely autistic first son. Second son was neurotypical, and her experience of taking him to nursery and watching amazed as he blended in with all the social goings on, making her realise that that's what she hadn't been able to do all her life. And just seeing her 2-year-old, I think he was, just doing it automatically, that brought to me the idea of that we have this sort of automatic social instinct. We don't have to think about allowing people to take turns in conversation or eye contact or all the unwritten rules of the social behaviour. And I think that's the difficulty that all autistic people have. Unfortunately, for autistic, the chameleon type autistic individuals, they actually have the motivation. They don't have the means, but they have the motivation. Whereas the Canna type autistic individuals have neither the means nor the motivation. And the order in which those arrived, we don't know. So I think, yes, the issue is the camouflaging is the core of it. Because once people started realising that in a way Lorna Wing was very prescient and these individuals were disguising the problem. And at that point, just as an aside, sometimes people get anxious because it feels deceitful. And people could say, oh, well, no wonder we didn't know they were autistic because they were hiding it all the time. It's not like that. It results from a fear of being rejected effectively. And the fact that these individuals have that fear, suffer more from social rejection than most of us do, and we all do, is where the different presentation comes from. So I think the why of camouflaging, there was a lot of industry when people realised these people were camouflaging. How do we measure it? Because by definition, it's difficult to see. So there was a kind of industry around describing camouflaging and interviewing people, do you camouflage, etc. And it wasn't until a bit later, and really I think that part of the message of my book is, why are they doing it? If they're autistic, why? So yes, it presents differently and this is where I get to the cannas versus the chameleons, because it kind of gets me slightly off the hook with men versus women. So there are individuals, most of whom are men, autistic individuals, most of whom are men who present one way, autistic individuals, most of whom are women who present another.
I want to ask you, Gina, because I found really one of the most moving parts of the book when you were talking about what is it like to be you. There's a real deep humanity in your writing in this book, and I really, really appreciated it on just a very personal level. And I wanted to ask you a little bit about, as the people you spoke to, a lot of people during your research, and I'm kind of wondering if you can share with us, the experiences that people related to you as far as what it was like? We've talked about camouflaging and such. There's a healthy population of autistic individuals who are walking around discovering that they're autistic well into their 20s, 30s, and 40s as they become aware of these of autism, what this means. Can you talk a little bit about some of the ways in which people express? And I don't want to give away the entire book, but can you talk a little bit about ways or stories that people relate to you? Like, what's their lived experience? What does it mean for these women or girls to be autistic in the world?
Yes. Well, I think probably it was a real eye opener for me, I have to say. And as a career-long brain imager, one of the things as a psychologist, one of the things you spent a lot of time doing is how do we operationalize this difficulty, whatever, and you find ways of making a task that will work in a scanner, which you believe somehow captures something which distinguishes one group of people from another. And you kind of get drawn into that. And you don't actually say to the person, when you were playing that computer game where people were throwing balls to each other and not throwing them to you, does that resonate with how you experience your life, kind of thing? And it was really the personal testimonies of women, late diagnosed women, which came out in the last decade or so, which alerted me to this and which allowed me to then talk to go out and interview people. And they varied a lot. I mean, one thing, the saddest ones, I have to say, were the youngest ones, children in primary school who, and very often they're very self-reflective, because I guess if, you spend all your time trying to work out why nobody likes you or why they won't, they call you weird or they won't let you join in your games. And a complete aside, get me very angry about bullying, but that's perhaps another aspect.
I'm very familiar with it.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. So I think the idea was that the stories I heard were very anecdotal. I think there was a child of Victoria, I think it was My Little Pony or something. She kind of thought that everybody's got a My Little Pony. So if I get a My Little Pony, they'll like me and I'll be part of their group. And then she got the wrong My Little Pony kind of thing, which, symbolized what these girls were going through. And almost invariably, these are primary school girls. And it's quite unusual, unless the girls present a bit like boys, that autism is recognized at that stage. The tipping point for girls seems to be adolescence and the move to secondary school, because that is, and I think the chapter's called The Perfect Storm, because you talked about your teenage boys, the adolescent brain is, one kind of storm in itself, universally. If you're also autistic and bringing with you 11, 12 years of the struggles you'd already been through, and you may have developed some strategies which kind of seem to work in your nice, safe little primary school environment. You go to secondary school, it's huge, nothing's predictable anymore. There's all this kind of social reorganization and cliques and friendship groups which, break up week by week or something. Hugely complicated. So those are different kind of stories, and very often linked. I mean, I spoke to quite a few girls with eating disorders, because there is a high incidence of eating disorders in the autistic population, and autistic presentations in the eating disorder population. And very often it was they just couldn't cope anymore, and there was almost like a meltdown. And talking to parents of these girls, they would say she was never any problem at primary school. The teachers said she was a bit shy, but she was, very, very particular about getting her homework done. And yes, she had friends, or she always had one special friend, and so they're as taken aback, as everybody else. And then the older women, particularly some who there weren't so many of these reported to me, but it's reported a lot in the testimonies, who'd had quite abusive relationships because they were so desperate for any kind of relationship. And they were also not very good at picking up social cues, that they found themselves in very abusive relationships because they now look back and say, because of their autism, they felt, I mean, there were, it's never a straightforward story. So a lot of sad stories. Some more creative people I spoke to had nice stories, because they said, people always thought, they have wonderful paintings, for example, lovely poetry. And people thought I was really weird, and now I realise it's my autistic brain. So there's kind of joy associated with it as well, which is nice.
It's so funny you say that, exactly, because my son Jack says it's my autism brain. He just runs with it, and the reason why I can be so forthcoming with this is because both my boys are like, yeah, I'm autistic. Let's go. Care, this is who I am, and this is just part of what makes me.
That's great.
Me.
Great to hear. Really good. Yeah.
Well, it took a long time to get there, Gina. And I saw firsthand, with my boys. You mentioned the bullying. I mean, I was this close to tearing up. You probably saw when you mentioned that, because as a father, any parent sees their kids get bullied. It's rough, but autistic kids, they get it. They catch a lot of it. I want to ask you, this work is so important, talking about girls and women, all the way back to the history. You're talking about the work of the women researchers who have helped bring this forward. Can I ask you, as we kind of come to a close here on this, what happens when we better include girls and women into the fold, as you say in the book, of the autistic community? How does this help us understand autism and, frankly, what it is to be human?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'm hoping the book will help. I think, as I mentioned, that there was a call to arms, as it were, about almost 10 years ago, in the neuroscience community, saying, maybe I was just behind the curve, saying, we really need to start looking more carefully at females on the spectrum as well. And that, of course, has unpacked the whole pipeline problem, because initially you couldn't look at girls because none had been diagnosed, because the diagnostic dice were loaded against them. And anyway, nobody recognised that they might need a diagnosis, kind of thing. So it's unpacked that. So that's helped. So we now have a greater opportunity at a kind of mechanistic research level. So for people like me, that's interesting. But I appreciate that might not be, the today problem that autistic people would like solved. What they want solved is more understanding. And I think understanding that not everybody has this automatic social facility. And this comes back, in fact, to the bullying. Because, and again, I have to be careful, I think the bullying is much worse in girls, or the reports I got of bullying.
Yeah.
And so, in particular, because it was almost as though they found the weak spot. These girls are desperate to belong, so we will bully them by calling them weird and, messing around with friendships, etc. So I think part of it would be, sounds like a bumper sticker, let's be kind to each other. But, involving more of an understanding that people experience the world differently. There has been moves at a more fundamental level, like theatres in this country have autism-friendly performances. So appreciating that this is a genuine problem. It's not just get a grip kind of thing. Wear dark glasses if you find the lights too bright. So an understanding that there are individuals who genuinely have very different sensory experiences from us, and that will affect their lives. And it's an accommodation that's easy to make. But I think the double empathy problem that I mentioned right at the end, where autistic, and I think I also talk about through the looking glass, because I got this impression that autistic people are on one side of the looking glass looking into a socially fluent world, and that the socially fluent world is looking into the autistic world thinking, I've got no idea why these people are like that. And actually, it's not that hard. It's a bit of an effort. Certainly an effort writing the book, but there's enough out there that we can educate ourselves to include autistic people, and also as a general kind of society. I mean, there's a move which slightly makes me anxious about people saying, oh, let's emphasize how good autistic people are at paying attention to detail or coding or something. So, isn't it, we'll advertise a job and say, not necessarily, are you autistic, but trying to encourage people to employ autistic people because of their quirks, as opposed to the fact that, they are just individuals who experience the world differently. So I think, as I say, it sounded a bit bumper stickerish, but as a neuroscientist who contributed largely to the problem until quite recently, I should not, and I can't be on any kind of high moral ground. And getting teachers to distinguish more clearly between Jack and Chloe, or not to distinguish between Jack and Chloe, that would be another thing.
Gina, I have to tell you, I have a stack over to my right of about 150 books that the publisher has sent to me to review and things like that for the podcast. And I'm not making this up. I'm going to tell you, when this arrived and they reached out to me about this book, I was immediately like, yes. I am so thankful to you for writing this book and sitting down talking to me about work. It's personal to me. And I think a lot for our audience, it's going to be personal to them as well. And this is the work that we need in the world. So I am really, really thankful to you for writing this and taking time to talk to us today. This has been something I was very, very much looking forward to this conversation in a lot of different ways. And so I'm so glad we could do this today.
Thank you so much. That means a lot, because it was not a long struggle, but it was an eye opener for me. So I'm glad that it's had the same effect for you.
Definitely. And the book is on sale as of April 1st, correct?
Indeed. Yes, the beginning of Autism Acceptance Month. So
we're going to have
lots of that, hopefully.
We're going to have this pod up on April 1st so people can listen in and buy it. And I'll put links on social media, everything like that. So if you're listening, it's here in the States, it's Off the Spectrum: Why the Science of Autism Has Failed Women and Girls. And Gina Rippon, thank you so much for being here. This has been amazing.
Thank you for the conversation. It's been great. Thank you.